Hi, I'm author Evie Rhodes, and I want to share a few chapters with you from my novel, Out of Order. I invite you into the world of Out of Order at this time. The prologue. It was cold. Shivering, icy needles jabbed at her body. The needles poked along, starting with a slow crawl from the tips of her toes. The liquid feel of ice water rushed through her veins. It reminded her of the time she was ice skating and had fallen through the ice, becoming submerged up to her neck. Boy, was she scared, just as she was now. There was a dull ringing in her ears. It had squashed out all the other sounds. Maybe that was good, because she could no longer hear for the shrieking, screaming confusion that was going on around her. God, it was so dark. She didn't want to be in this place by herself. Her fingers were going numb. She floated as parts of her system shut down, distancing her from the searing pain that had rammed into her, knocking her to the ground. A scorching, black, jabbing pain had shot through her chest cavity, leaving a trail like a blazing forest fire. She grew warmer. She couldn't feel the cold any longer. Up ahead of her was a bright light. She drifted toward the light so she could stay warm. She didn't want to be in the dark alone. "Daddy!" she called, the sound coming out as though her voice were a whistling tea kettle. It was the last time she ever spoke. A whoosh of air exhaled from her damaged lungs, exiting out into the streets of Newark. She had a last lucid thought, one that skirted the edges of adulthood, though she was a child. I'm only 8 years old, and I don't want to die. She gave a last hushed breath, barely audible, and all sound and feeling ceased to exist for her. A moment ago, the air had been still, but now the trees rustled with the spirit of the unknown, leaving the dead child as though she were no more than a carcass lying in the street. Chapter 1. Aisha Jackson ran up to Jasmine and she tagged her. "You're it," she shouted. Jasmine stomped her foot, starting to count. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. The kids squealed, laughing. They ran to find hiding places. At the corner of the block, several young men were hanging out. Standing on the corner of Muhammad Ali Boulevard and 18th Avenue, as though he owned it and everything within its range, was Tremaine Perry, who was 17 years old. He was a tall, rangy, wiry youth with an edgy, moody personality. His dark edge was a source of attraction, but his restlessness was a magnet of trouble. "Never one to miss a shot," he said. "Man, Ballistic is trying to roll down on niggas. It's time to drop that nigga. He can't get no action on this turf. That punk is from Irvington. How does he think he's going to get a slice of Newark's pie? This is Port Newark, baby. We running things up in here." Rico DeLeon Hudson was 19 years old. He was serious, methodical, and as territorial as a panther roaming the jungle. Although he was a good 2 inches shorter than Tremaine's 6 feet 1 inches, there was no doubt that he was the leader. He was persona grata, respected, awed, and not to be played with. Rico had been dodging bullets and running the streets and true to the game since he was 12 years old. He had always been the leader. Everyone who was anybody on the streets knew Rico. He sported a nappy afro that was always groomed to perfection. His face was angular, sleek, and his eyes admitted one truth if one looked closely enough. That truth was death. It sprang from the depth of his eyes as lithe as a panther. His deception was the seeming innocence that oozed from him. He was a mother's nightmare. A slick sheen of charm covered the veneer of who he really was. Underneath the veneer of innocence was a cold, cruel, calculating mind. He was of a generation that had to have it all right now by any means necessary. Coming in second was not an option. Rico stared at Tremaine. They had been running the streets together since elementary school. They had taken a blood oath to always have each other's back. Rico, who was always dressed in the latest sports gear, tugged at the collar of his leather jacket. He straightened the hood on the jacket and then stuffed his hands in his pockets. He stepped to the curb, swearing under his breath. High up on a roof, Spence Parkinson was dressed in black, completed with a black cap pulled low covering his forehead. He aimed the weapon with the scope at Rico. Rico stepped into sharp focus and Spence nodded his head slightly. Jasmine shouted even louder, 5, 4, 3, 2. She ran toward the corner. Spence hoisted and balanced the weapon. He zoomed in. The scope teetered back and forth. Rico stooped down on the side of Tremaine. The scope followed him. The red dot centered on his heart. Jasmine careened into Rico, shouting, 1! Rico jumped back. The rifle kicked and the blast let loose, ripping through the girl child Jasmine. Her arms spread like the wings of an angel, her body airborne. The blast lifted her off her feet, knocking her to the ground. Rico's crew ducked and ran. Kids screamed. A high-pitched wail sliced through the air. Rico did not know whose it was, but it shattered him in a deep, secret place. The entire incident had happened in a split second. For an instant, every bit of noise on the street became a deafening silence. The kids running up and down froze as though someone had shouted, freeze frame. Rico rolled Jasmine over, staring into the dull expression on the little girl's face. Though it was out of character for him, gently he cradled her in his arms, running a hand through her hair. Blood smeared all over his leather jacket, and the acrid smell of the blood and the gunpowder drifted up into his nostrils. Tremaine was bugging. What the hell is Rico doing? He tugged on Rico's jacket. Let her go, man. Come on, we got to raise up out of here. At the sound of Tremaine's voice, Rico recovered, jumping to his feet. They cleared the area as though they had never been in existence. In an instant, they were ghosts. A crowd gathered in the street. Jasmine lay face up on the concrete where Rico had dropped her. Marcus Sims, who was 10 years old and Jasmine's best friend, stared at her lying on the ground. He trembled as he saw her blood seep into the dirty gutter. He watched it trickle and spill down into the sewer at the edge of the curb. Her eyes were sightless. Her face was expressionless. She resembled a porcelain doll that had been abandoned in someone's wake. Although the air had been still a moment ago, the trees now shook with an unknown spirit. Marcus stared into the trees, watching what amounted to a mist until it disappeared. He heard an unearthly shrieking that pierced the core of his being. Although he couldn't quite make out the words that were being shrieked, it sounded like something scraping across glass. The sound was high-pitched and shattering. From the corner of his eye, he saw a huge pair of black wings flapping, or thought he did. He blinked. It was gone. He turned back to the shell that was Jasmine Davenport. Frozen in place, he did not move. Unconsciously, he whispered, someone please call 911. Knowing that in his neighborhood, that's all it was. A call, a disembodied voice on a wire. There was no real savior for them on the other end of the line. That thought sent a tear chasing a spot of dirt down Marcus's cheek. They were standing on shaky ground, and that ground was Newark, New Jersey, the Central Ward. Newark's Central Ward was legendary, even among the dark and dangerous. The most curious thing about the Central Ward was the level of cohabitation. It was home to some of the most notorious, ruthless thugs breathing, as well as to those who were regular citizens struggling for upward mobility. And of course, there was always the low income, those who were simply trapped. Not having any paper to spread around meant they were not captains of their own existence. They were the forgotten victims sitting on a patch of dirt that society at large had basically given up on. Victims of those who knew how to drain money out of misery and were raking in the cream at the expense of the downtrodden and defenseless. There were housing apartment complexes that you simply couldn't go in. There were pockets of the Central Ward where death lurked in every corner and crevice. In almost every sound, there was the click of a gun barrel, the sliding of a clip, or laser rays that tracked human heartbeats. And your own shadow was something you wouldn't see. If you saw a shadow, most likely it would be a silhouette of death. There were projects where a person could disappear, never to be heard from again. Many a skeleton cried out from behind the cement walls. The projects had their own Roman security. Packs of young boys, ranging in age from 8 to 14, had it locked down. Corporate America had never employed security that was as tight as this. Coexisting right alongside the older apartment complexes were new developments with landscaped lawns, barbecue grills, and bright, shiny new Cadillac Escalades in the driveway. There was a very conflicting contrast between someone trying to make a change, as the new developments were testament to, and those who would not change one iota. There were those who were as forgotten as the older, dilapidated buildings, people leaning out of the windows on hot days, gunshots ringing out in the hallways, or blood flung against the walls. And even the least of the animals in the jungle knew that it was the fittest of the fit that survived. But these were not animals. These were people. They were living, breathing souls, all trying to survive. In some cases, they were trying to survive in surroundings not fit for human habitation and in conditions that should long ago not have existed. In the final scheme of things, the Central Ward was not about surviving. On the surface, it appeared to be, but it wasn't. You weren't surviving if you were scared to death, trapped and couldn't get out. You were just one of the living dead, and in this death there was no light. The mechanism for survival had died long ago. This was defeat, existing but never living. The Central Ward was actually about law and lawlessness, and what the rulers thereof decided. On the corners of these streets, the churches, the bodegas, the liquor stores competed for passing bodies. Needless to say, the churches weren't winning out, and no one could really figure out why. The churches were dying on the same corners as the people, since there was a lack of youth to fill the inside pews. There were barely any children to add their voices to the choir, and although the body drops were occurring at an alarming rate, there were no bodies to fill up the pews in search of salvation, freedom, or hope. An entire 2 generations was missing from the church. Business at Perry and Wiggum funeral homes, which were located around the corner from each other, was at an all-time high. They were raking in the remains of what the churches did not. Death had become a profitable business in the black community. Death was the only real means of escape. It was for some the only way to get out. And then there was darkness. It sprouted from the souls of men, it danced and their blood spilled in the streets, and it permeated the very air they breathed. They lived with darkness on a daily basis, even when the sun was shining. Yet they didn't see it and couldn't really comprehend it. Darkness had become an invisible shroud. They didn't know what it truly was, and they didn't know its name. Not really, because they didn't believe in the Savior. They didn't believe they could combat the darkness. They thought that was just the way it was. Deceit was at its highest level. The players being played because they didn't believe they had the power to change it. And if you didn't believe in power, you couldn't receive it. Such was the Central Ward. The tragedy of it was they didn't see it, couldn't see it. God, why couldn't they see it? Death was an alternate escape route. Little Jasmine Davenport had escaped. Marcus Sims, who sat watching her lifeblood disappear into the sewer, had seen, but as of yet he didn't know what he'd seen. Someone please call 911. he whispered for the second time that day into an empty pit where no one seemed to answer. His voice was a small echo in a really big abyss. After all, this was the Central Ward. There really wasn't any hurry, was there? Jasmine Davenport was only one of the children who were lost, and she could count herself lucky because she had escaped with her soul. There were many others who would not. Welcome to the Central Ward. And be forewarned, when you enter the world of Out of Order, you're going to need to see this story with your spirit, not just with your eyes. Upon this reading, you have crossed a realm and entered a different world. It is a world that coexists by its own laws, and that world, in and out of itself, is out of order. Believe that. Hi. Out of Order, being continued, Chapter 2. Finally, there was a rush for the little dead black girl in the vehicle with the red flashing lights. The ambulance carrying Jasmine screeched to a halt in front of Beth Israel Hospital. The lights flashed and the sirens rang out full blast, and the equivalent of a black beast passed in their midst, invisibly viewing the spoils of its own revenge. Its latest carcass was little Jasmine Davenport. The medical attendants jumped out of the back door. They hauled the stretcher holding Jasmine with breakneck speed through the emergency room doors. They were a day late and $1 short, but the appearance of saving a life needed to go on. Jasmine's daddy, Shannon Davenport, 36 years old, a tall, slim man, was right on their heels. Fire, devastation, and despair were competing with each other from under his heavily lashed eyes. He had insisted they bring his daughter to Beth Israel, although UMDNJ was where she should have gone. In retrospect, he would realize this request was nothing more than misplaced pride and authority in a situation in which he'd had absolutely no control. The medical attendants hauled the stretcher through another set of doors. He did not miss a step. He was right behind them. A young doctor blocked his path. "I'm sorry, you can't go in there." He pushed the doctor with brute force. He flew backward, landing on his behind. As Shannon reached down to grab him by his collar, a white police officer in uniform issued a chokehold on him from behind. He dropped low, elbowing the cop in a soft spot, breaking the hold. The cop landed on the floor with the breath knocked out of him. The doctor scrambled to his feet, looking around a little dazed. A short distance away, a black uniformed officer watched the unfolding scene with interest. He saw his partner put his hand on his gun. Deciding it was definitely time to swing into action, he ran over to where the commotion was taking place. "That's enough, and you just hold it right there," he said to Shannon Davenport. He put out a warning hand to keep him in his place while helping his partner to his feet with the other hand. "Now just who are you?" he said. "I'll tell you who he is. He's a stupid punk who's going to jail," the officer who had been knocked to the floor said. Shannon glared at him. "When hell freezes over." The doctor, not liking where this was leading, spoke up. "Just a minute. Maybe I can be of some help here. Are you with the little girl that was just brought in?" "Yeah." "What's your name?" the doctor said. Shannon Davenport. "That's my little girl in there, and I need to know that she's going to be okay." The police officers relaxed. This man was one of the many distraught parents they ran into when they were working the emergency room shift. Although they did not like his actions, under the circumstances, they decided to forgive them for the time being. The officer who had been knocked to the ground said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. No harm done, okay?" Shannon nodded. The black officer sighed, rolling his eyes at the ceiling. "Mr. Davenport, your daughter was radioed in as critical. It only complicates things to have people in the room who are not part of the procedure. Just let us try to stabilize her first. I promise, as soon as she is stable, I will personally come out and talk to you, okay?" He put a soothing hand on Shannon's shoulder. Shannon nodded. His face was etched in grief, a picture of both gut-wrenching hope and the truth hovering behind denial. "How about a cup of coffee while you wait?" the black officer said. "Yeah, okay, thanks." Behind the closed doors, Jasmine lay in a bed on a mound of white sheets and blankets. Blood was staining the hospital linen at an alarming rate. The atmosphere was tense. They had hooked her up to monitors, and tubes were protruding from her arms and mouth. A small platoon of doctors diligently worked on her, and a number of nurses assisted. They did everything they could to restore life to the little girl's lifeless body, but it was to no avail. Finally, they had exhausted every possibility. The young doctor who Shannon Davenport had knocked to the floor looked at the monitor, seeing the flat line. He ran a hand through his hair, and he bowed his head in despair. Damn, not again. He glanced at the small, still face of the little girl. She was a beautiful child who had turned out to be another body drop. She's gone. The truth of the matter is she was gone when she got there. But we had to try, the older doctor said. The doctors and nurses slid off their masks. They removed their blood-stained rubber gloves. Someone turned off the pump and various machines, silencing the low hum that had been emitted throughout the room. The older doctor, sensing the young doctor's despair, put a hand on his shoulder. The young doctor shrugged it off. This is the third child in a month. He walked over and glanced at Jasmine's chart. From the same neighborhood. What the hell is going on over there? What kind of monsters gun down children in broad daylight? The older doctor sighed. Look, Peter, there's nothing we can do except try to save their lives when they arrive. Someone needs to do that before they arrive, Dr. Spinelli, because by the time they arrive, most of the time, it's too late. Chapter 3. Tawny Davenport raced through the emergency room doors. Her hair hung limp in a string of wild-looking curls. Tears streaked her face. Her eyes had a haunting, savage look to them, and she spotted Shannon drinking a cup of coffee. The emergency room at Beth Israel Hospital was jam-packed. It was a picture of total chaos. Beth Israel received about 80,000 annual visits, including approximately 24,000 annual emergency room visits in pediatrics. This made for a hotbed of emergency medical treatment that was needed at any given time. Located in the heart of Newark, Beth Israel was at its busiest when Tawny ran through the doors. There were an array of injuries that needed to be attended to, including gunshot wounds, stabbings, domestic abuse, as well as those who had fallen victim to the savage beast of gangbanging. Stress was at an all-time high in the neighborhood of Newark, so there were cardiac patients, heart attacks, and a man afflicted with a stroke. High blood pressure was rampant, the silent killer of the black community. It seemed as though the entire city of Newark had turned out for medical treatment. When Tawny burst through the emergency room doors of Beth Israel, all eyes that could followed her did, and she broke through the monotonous weight of pain and suffering. Shannon, oh God, Shannon, where's my baby? What happened? Shannon reached out to gather Tawny in his arms, but she backed away. She knocked the cup of coffee from his hand, and the coffee splattered all over his shoes. Please, don't. Do not touch me. Do not. I want to know what happened to my daughter. Again, he reached for her. Tawny threw both her hands in the air, and she stepped back. Just tell me that this is a mistake. Tell me that you didn't let anybody shoot my baby. He dropped his head, not meeting her eyes. Look at me, Shannon. The white police officer moved forward, but his black partner put a restraining hand on his arm. Tawny, Jazz is going to be all right. The doctors are going to make sure. Tawny turned her back. The blood was drumming in her ears. She couldn't believe what she just heard. He must be crazy. She turned back, looking at him as though he was stupid. She started to speak, sputtered, and then tried again. The doctors are going to make sure my baby is all right. It was your job, Shannon, to make sure that my baby was all right. The damn doctors are not God, so how would they know? Tell me how the hell they would know. Tell me, huh? How would they know? Tawny's voice was a high octave, screeching across notes like that of an opera singer out of control. Tears shone in Shannon's eyes. His shoulders slumped. He bowed his head. His voice was deep and husky when he spoke. I'm sorry. She was outside playing with the other kids. The last time I checked, she was fine. At that moment, Peter Connolly, the young doctor, stepped through the doors. He walked over to Shannon and he glanced briefly at Tawny. As if on cue, all noises in the emergency room ceased for the briefest of moments. The silence was absolutely eerie. I want to see my daughter, man. Is she all right? My wife and I want to see her right now. Peter's expression turned solemn. His eyes darted in the cop's direction. Briefly, they flitted at Tawny. The cops moved closer. Peter looked at Shannon. I'm sorry. We did everything we could. She was too far gone. Tawny's shrill screams ripped through the air, sending shock waves rippling through the room. All motion came to a halt. No! She screamed. No! Oh, God, no! No, it can't be. My baby is dead. Jazz is dead. I want to see Jazz. Jazz! Jazz! She broke into a run. Everyone ran behind her. She burst through the doors, and she saw her daughter lying silently where she had been left. Jazz, 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 wake up. It's Mommy. I'm here, Jazz. It's time to wake up now. Come on, Jazz. Come on, we have to go home. Her mind screamed one long, shrieking wail. She couldn't hear herself think. The screaming was too loud. It just instantly seized a hold of her brain, and for a moment she thought she would faint, but she had to stay on her feet. She had to be there for her baby. She took a deep breath, and with it a tentative step toward the remains of her child. When she reached the bed, she looked at the blood-drenched sheets in horror. Her face crumbled as though it were only a mask, held together by a flimsy foundation. She looked at her little girl's face, and her own became a portrait of wretched, heart-wrenching despair. She put her face close to Jazz's. She lifted a dead arm to put around her neck. Jazz's arm fell back to the bed. Tawny tried again, this time holding Jazz's arm in place. She put her nose against the child's neck, where a warm pulse should have been beating. They all looked on. There was nothing to say. Anything said would be the worst type of intrusion. Shannon stood alone with a blank look in his eyes as he watched Tawny holding their dead daughter. Jazz, wake up. Wake up, Jazz, okay? Wake up now so Mommy can take you home. Jazz, wake up. Tawny whispered to the little girl. At those words, Shannon turned away. Pain sliced through him as though someone had gutted him with a shiv. The black police officer touched Shannon on the shoulder. Mr. Davenport, I'm sorry, but we need to ask you a few questions. Would you mind stepping out with us? Shannon gazed at his wife and daughter and then shot Dr. Connolly a look. The doctor lifted his chin for Shannon to go. He moved closer to Tawny, who was still holding and whispering to her dead daughter, another child lost in the belly of the beast. And that concludes the third chapter of Out of Order that I wanted to share with you all. It's another world. I hope that you and your families will be blessed. Thank you. I'm Evie Rhodes, and it's Out of Order.